This is your requirements panel. Truth in Lending, as a serial moderator for all of the Quad A Mission Solution Summits, you get to have some input into panel structure and what topics that you want to talk about. And if you can recall, last year we tried to marry up the TRADOC capability managers with the program managers to talk synergy, what was going on in each of their areas, how that worked. This year, given the changes with the establishment of Army's Futures Command, as well as the Concepts Directorate, the former ARCIC at Training and Doctrine Command, the reorganization, and in some cases, the way business is done between what will be a current fielded force as well, and then a future force that we're trying to get at. So if any of you all were at the VLC meeting yesterday afternoon, Mike Best, the seated director for Army Futures Command and for the Concept Development Directorate, I think, formerly ARCIC, gave a great laydown in terms of the change that has occurred and the way that they're doing business. The other piece on this is that we want to make sure that we include the total force here, and so we didn't have Special Operations Aviation Command represented, and so we do this year. The way I'll kind of run this is I will introduce him. Mike Roeder is the director of SIMO. Colonel Mike Burns is currently the Requirements Determination Division for Platforms. Mike Demergeron has the Fielded Force Integration Division, or Directorate, excuse me, at Fort Rucker. And then Ryan Coyle, who's the serial participant in all these panels, has the Requirements Determination Division for Enablers. And my in-law, Colonel Retired Ellis Golson, has Concepts and Experimentation, which is part of Colonel Mike Best's organization, his CDID. So I have asked them each to kind of talk about their areas of responsibility, what's going on in their area, what's important to them, what their challenges are. And I thought it was good because Mike is going to get the gold star because he actually provided some slides that you all could take a look at. So if you could bring up the SIMO slides, please. I'm going to turn this over to Mike Roeder.
All right, thanks, sir. Appreciate that. I'm not sure I listened to the guidance very well, because when I was thinking about putting this together, I was really thinking from the perspective of the things that I've been hearing over the past few years. And if you look at what the CFTs are doing and Futures Command is doing, as the SIMO guy, I often hear it's like, well, they're trying to replicate what SOF does to some degree. And we have all kinds of discussions about whether that's a good idea or not, but I also realize that a lot of people don't even really know what SIMO is. And so I just want to very briefly run through that and hopefully make some ties to the other things that we're going to talk to. So I'm not sure who's running my slides, but if we can just go from there. So of course, we have a mission statement. There it is. I won't read it to you, but at the regiment for our SOAC at the 160th, there is an organization called the Systems Integration Management Office, and it has operators who come and work for me as an acquisition guy. I really work for them, of course, but those are the people at the regiment who are truly developing the requirements. We're resourced in such a way that the guys will come off the line for a period of 2 to 3 years. They will work in one of the platform cells or mission equipment. They will take a good idea, whether that comes from a peer or comes from a higher level as a requirement down. We will formalize that, write it if necessary, and then it will flow back through TAPO, our main program office, and then we'll actually test that capability and make sure it's the right thing. So, that's what the mission statement is supposed to show us, that, it's our job to make sure that we have that comparative advantage on the battlefield for the regiment. Next. So, a lot of times, we talk about doing everything faster. With we want to get the FVL aircraft out there faster. We want to get capabilities to the warfighter faster. And the bottom line is, you're really talking about agile systems engineering. And whether the regiment called it that or not, they've really been doing that since the inception. I don't intend to go through all of those individual things we do, but the reality is that those are the core competencies that we're trying to replicate as we go through our processes for delivering that capability. Agile is the term that you see on pretty much every one of our slides, and you hear people talk about it all the time. Well, what does it really mean to be agile? So I'm trying to convey, at the operator level, how we are actually, doing an instantiation of agile systems engineering. Next, please. So I'll talk a little bit about some, tenets of success at the end here, but this is really a Colonel Dave Phillips slide. So one of the keys that we have is, implied is the operator is involved in the requirements development process and in the testing and delivering that capability. But it requires a tight group of people where you have the capability developer, the material developer at TAPO or one of the other PMs, and the resource sponsor at our SOAC, and then down in PEO Rotary Wing to actually help us from a funding perspective. Across the bottom, you see that we are talking to all those other agencies out there because we can't do this ourselves, but it's working very efficiently within that triangle to move faster. Next. All right, so this is really Mike Roeder's take on, Agile isn't easy. There's some reality there that you have to write requirements, obviously, and there's somewhat of a misnomer that within SOF we don't write requirements, we don't fully develop requirements, that we have different rules. Reality is we have the same rules as everybody else, but how you actually go about executing Agile, at least from my perspective, is we put as much of the team next to the project as possible. So I already talked about the operators being there. I have requirements writers right inside of the office. We're doing soft SIDS documents versus JSIDS documents. Sometimes it's a memorandum that is going to be an ECP or something like that, but we're still writing a requirement that's going to get managed by a program manager and then come back to the user, the operator, to test it, to make sure it's the right thing to put on the aircraft. And really, most of the other stuff there is no surprise, right? You communicate often and make sure everybody knows what's going on so you can make those changes. Empowering the team to make decisions at the lowest level. It's sometimes scary that guys, W4s within my branch cells, they're actually making decisions on what it is that capability is intended to deliver and whether or not it works or not. Fail early and often. We are actually just starting a process where we're going to help out General Rugen and the CFTs a little bit to test some concepts. And they may not work. We think they're technologies that are mature enough where we can rapidly integrate them, but that's the right answer, not just within the regiment, but across what we're trying to do across the Army with looking at technologies that are ready to go, hopefully put on platforms later on. And I heard in the last panel as well that that 80% solution is sometimes good enough. That's one of our key tenets. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. If we can develop something that's at a TRL 8, even 9 level, we'll strap it on an aircraft and we'll accept that you're going to improve that over time. Of course, that assumes that you can mitigate some risk, right? So when you're talking airworthiness, you can't always accept a risk that is good enough. You have to actually get something that's going to be safe, suitable, and effective. Next. So I'm actually going to skip most of this. This is just show as an example of, we follow a process. The requirements either get pushed down to us or they get developed by a user. They get validated at the regiment, the CG level, and then we decide how we're going to document them, get them down and approved and funded. Next. Next slide, please. And so you get off the stage slide is the one question I get quite often, actually, is so why doesn't everybody do things the way you do? I've already kind of talked to, maybe we're trying to get there, but there is risk. And if you look at what is a pretty common chart to maybe a lot of us, as you obligate or commit those dollars to the program, it doesn't take very long before you're pretty significantly committed from a funding perspective. And you probably can't see in the slide there, but as that diagonal arrow goes up, you get to a point where the cost to extract defects or the cost to make changes gets extremely expensive. So one of the things that I think is a cautionary tale for everybody who's working FVL and trying to go faster is you really do have to make sure that we're appropriately documenting those requirements. And I know you got super smart people working on that, obviously most of them here, and it's just something to pay attention to so that hey, we want technologies that are going to be those things that FBL needs to be, but we have to make sure that we're upfront taking that into consideration of what's suitable at this time, which lends itself into define the subsystem allocations early. When we focus on swap weight and power, obviously, and sometimes we'll get it wrong. We'll put something on there that is too heavy. We have some issues right now. We're trying to figure out how to make the aircraft lighter. If you don't make those allocations later or early and stick to them, you might find yourself in problems later on with the aircraft. And I already talked to testing concepts and leveraging maturity, and sort of a bumper stick for everything. You make sure you have the right guys actually going through this process is something that we have an advantage from taking operators, putting them on the team, so they deliver the capabilities that they really need for the warfight. Stage setter, how do you do?
Okay, so I'm Colonel Mike Burns. I'm the director of the Aviation Platforms Requirement Determination Directorate. So what does that mean? If Mike Best, the seated director, was here, what he'd explain is with the advent of Army Futures Command and the stand-up of the CFTs, the roll-down impact of that to the Center of Excellence and the CDID was, in essence, we looked across that force of what you're used to being the TICMs, TICM Recon Attack, Lift, Aviation Brigade, and FVL, and asked ourselves, who's working futures requirements and who's working current force requirements and actions. And really, to describe the dividing line, the best way I could put it, although it's a little bit of a blurred line, is if you require a requirements document to make that change, the JSIDS process, if you're familiar with that, in the milestone process, if it's right of milestone C, it belongs, it's to the current, the guys operating the current fleet, so fielding, testing, getting it out there. If it's left of milestone C, it's a requirements and it's a future force issue. Not a super clean cut, but it gives you an idea. And it's kind of a CUOPS, FUOPS, current ops, future ops. So there are some transitions back and forth. So how did we approach that? If you remember or familiar with the old under TRADOC, when we were all under TRADOC, you had the capabilities, Concept Development and Integration Directorate, which was Colonel Tom von Eschenbach, now Colonel Best. And underneath them were the TICMs and then the concepts analysis experimentation that Ellis leads. So what we did was we reformulated and we took some of the assets out of the TICMs and created what's called a Fielded Force Integration Directorate. I'll let Mike Demersion talk to you a little bit about that, but they're basically responsible for the current force and the upgrades. All the future modifications and future requirements work came to what we called Requirements Determination Directorates. And that got split between myself for aviation platforms and then lethality, and Ryan Coyle for what we lovingly call cats and dogs, everything else, and survivability. And I'll tell you, I think he has the harder job. And then what we did is underneath those two entities, along with the concepts folks from Ellis Golson's and CDID, now belong to Army Futures Command. The TICMs rolled up underneath and changed their focus a little bit, or I should say scaled down their focus, not changed their focus, and rolled up stayed under TRADOC and the Center of Excellence. We didn't move, well, we're going to move some buildings, but we're not moving from Fort Rucker. We're still very much interconnected. We have some deliberate lines of coordination between USACE and Army Futures Command underneath the former ARCIC, now Futures Concepts Command. And then you have this thing called the CFT that came out that has a dotted line that's kind of a third line to us, which I would describe, if I were going to describe what CFT does for it, as a super integrator and champion. General Rugen in his position is championing and integrating us all, making sure that we're staying on the same sheet of music, we're all running in the same direction, and that we're fighting for and getting the resources and the priorities that you're seeing come about. So as an aviation platform guy, my portfolio grew. So what you have with Apaches and Chinooks is currently staying with the TICM because of where they are in those processes. But anything that goes in the future that would be a future requirement would come to me. Now that might generate from field feedback coming through the TICM, and then the decision would be how are we going to handle that. If it was a minor upgrade and it doesn't require a wholesale relook at the requirements, it might stay with the TICM. If it's a requirements document that's got to go through what you would think of as the historical JSIDS process, and what we know, whether that's an OTA, whether that's a mid-tier acquisition, whether that's a full-fledged 5000.02, that would come to me and my team, and we have to work closely and talk routinely with FFID to make sure that we're synced on those. And then how we reorganize internally is to get after those priorities. So in the platforms I have, FLRAA, FARA, FUAS, ALE, SCI, lethality, and then anything else that generates and comes up as a future requirement from a platform's perspective comes to me. The advent of, I would tell you, we're still doing a little storming, norming, and forming. The forming's coming along. Processes are being driven by AFC, trying to reduce duplication. But one of the things you're seeing that I really like from AFC, just to give you an example, is we're no longer in a rote method of staffing. AFC, with their advent of the leadership of General Murray and the big bat that they swing, has given us the opportunity to be innovative in how we staff and how we approach things. So we're doing targeted staffing as opposed to a lockstep historical staffing to get after. That's just one example of how we're trying to trim the time. But there is risk mitigation that has to happen. And we're walking the fine line between the deliberate long-term requirements and historical methods that you saw for validating requirements that end up fielding something that's already been outpaced twice by the time we get it in the field, and mitigating the risk of requirements creep by moving fast. What we had in the past, which was a very deliberate requirements validation process that we had a lot of confidence in, is moving faster now, and we're trying to keep that level of confidence, but realize that it's a little bit more of a fluid situation. If you want to move fast, you don't have the time that you used to have. The goodness is that we get the advantage of getting after technology sooner, but we have a greater challenge to lock in those requirements and do it with confidence and not have requirements creep be an impact later as we get after the solution. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike and let him talk FFID.
Thanks, Mike. So Colonel Mike Burns did a great job of describing exactly the breakout between RDD and FFID. Colonel Mike Demersion, the director for the Fielded Force Integration Directorate. I'm also dual-hatted as the TRADOC Capability Manager for Reconnaissance and Attack. That will be filled by somebody in FY20. He's in another assignment right now. Also, underneath FFID, I have the TRADOC Capability Manager for LIFT, and that's Colonel Mark Levine. He remains in position until he retires in December, at which point in time I'll take on that role as well for a time period until the next director comes in, also in FY20. Then we stood up a TRADOC program office for aviation brigades. So kind of some of the things that Ryan Coyle manages is now going to be managed by Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Kelly, and he's coming over to us this summer. The way we're going to break things down is, as you know, in LIFT, it has UH, CH, LUH, fixed wing. And so I'm going to take a portion of the fixed wing, the manned reconnaissance portion, and put that up underneath the reconnaissance and attack. So under reconnaissance, you'll have both manned and unmanned, and the traditional AH-64 and attack-centric. And then in LIFT, we'll focus primarily on air assault cargo type of missions. AB, we're still kind of working through some of all the programs that are going to come over to us in TICM or in TPO AB. But once we figure that out as part of the storming, norming, and forming bit, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. So you asked what's important to us. It's ensuring our current force remains viable in the multi-domain operations. So we still need to think about reach, lethality, protection, and sustainment on all of our current fleet. And how do we do that knowing that the current force is going to remain in the force for the next several decades? So those are the things that we're really concerned about. And how do we do that? Well, we get the user feedback. So the traditional role of a TICM has not changed. We will still receive input from the fielded force. We will work with our RDD brothers and sisters and write and determine what is needed to ensure we remain the force that we need to be in the future. So that's the second thing that's important to me, is working incredibly closely with my folks here to my left and my right. It's very important that we remain hand in hand as we move forward, working both FAR and FLRAA, FEL, and all the future things, because at some point in time, as Mike described, those are going to come right to the FFID because they will become the fielded force. We will start working with him closer sometime post Milestone B. We got to understand all the programmatics and history of the program so that once we get to the Milestone C decision and move forward, we have the basic understanding of what has happened. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Ryan Cole for his portion.
All right, so I think it's been laid out pretty well kind of how we're transitioning. I will tell you, just with the people that I work with, one of the biggest things at Rucker, you're still working with all of the same people to deliver the capability required by our soldiers. Just there's a few of us that are wearing different patches, and then there may be a little bit different office of primary responsibility versus one just taking it all the way through. So for example, used to be the director for TICM Aviation Brigades, and now, as it's been said, the Aviation Enabler Requirements Determination Directorate. In that portfolio, so people can start staging the questions now, is aircraft survivability equipment, so kind of the mission command piece, which is the radios and the network, air traffic services, aviation logistics, and also the uniform, whether you think MVGs or flight suit or the multiple things that go in. So that's the portfolio. And then I think, too, if you want to help us with some of our challenges, which industry's key to that, and every engagement I ever have, I learn something from industry that helps us either move faster, deliver a better capability, or kind of know, hey, maybe we need to relook that because somebody looked at it a little different way. But in that one, I think there's no doubt if you summed up some of what Futures Command is trying to do is deliver capability faster to soldiers to create an advantage over the enemy. I mean, it's basic to warfare. So any of those opportunities that you see where we can move faster, you can help us with that. I'd say one of those is really us better understanding the trades between kind of the capability that can be delivered, how fast that capability can be delivered, and for the cost. And when you can really start to talk or associate percentages with that, you can set senior leaders up for making good informed decisions. And that's one area that industry, I think it's been beneficial. I think also, just because it's aircraft survivability equipment, I've got to talk about the threat for a second. And I think those of you that deal with that on a daily basis, but I'd say anybody in this room should always be concerned about the threat, because those threats are what drive us to either mitigate gaps or to create advantages. So I would say any requirement always grounded is what is the threat? Who is our threat? Who is our pacing threat? So we've all got to be informed and understand that. So I think we all understand, technology is moving so fast right now. And, there's living and breathing people in all those nations that represent those threats to us. And they're attempting to outpace us just like we're attempting to outpace them. And then those same systems are being proliferated around the world, and even at a much faster pace. So if I just said, hey, what is happening with the threat? It's advancements in technology and the proliferation of those threats. So then it drives me to ask you to also help us figure out how to better leverage open systems approaches or open systems architecture. That means that we're going to go beyond FACE, we're going to establish standards, and the government will own an interface that will then allow all of you to compete to deliver in hardware and software, that software probably being in applications, hosted on processors, so we can keep pace with the enemy. I mean, there is systems in the past that by the time we fielded them across the force, it's obsolete. And we can't afford to do that, nor will the enemy allow us to do that. So that's one of those challenges. I would also say, and I think I'll end with this just to pass it off to Mr. Golson, at least involving the threat side, we are looking to advance where we no longer have to exploit threats. The day and the age where we can detect and defeat threats without always having to exploit them. So I'll just leave that out there as another big challenge and pass it off to Mr. Golson.
Good afternoon. I'm Ellis Golson. I'm the lead right now for concepts and experimentation. We're doing concepts so that these guys have an objective that they're trying to achieve. Essentially, take the operating environment, describe it in such a way that everybody understands it, and then develop concepts or means by which we can be successful in that operating environment. And then do experiments, either low fidelity or high fidelity experiments that refine that concept. So that then gives us a general guideline that we're using to say where we think we need to be in the future. A lot of discussion about multi-domain operations. That's not anything really that new. We've been working on it for 3 years. That kind of sounds bad, but we have been, because we didn't want to just give a half answer to what was going on. And there is much more experimentation and activity in a more refined status behind MDO, so it is a supportable concept, if you will, as a means by which we can be successful in the future OE. I don't want us to forget the rest of the DOTML while we're talking about material solutions. We still have to have good organizational design. We still have to train our personnel, both officer, pilot, and enlisted, to operate in that environment. So we can't just ignore the other piece of that and let it go and just build new kit. So with that, I'll just hand it off and back over to the moderator.
So Mike Best described it well. He said, hey, I don't work for General Rugen, but I work for General Rugen, right? And he goes, he's got like 3 bosses. I mean, he's, senior rated by General Wesley, General Gaylor's in his chain. Then there's PM Future Vertical Lift, as well as the CFT. So moderator's privilege, I get to ask the first question. So how about the integration with PM Colonel Clark, excuse me, how is that going? And then also with General Rugen, with the CFT, is there any difference there, that kind of thing? Be interested to.
I'll jump on the grenade. Difference, you mean difference in how we used to do it, or So the PM. So the PM is a little bit of a little different for what we're doing with FVL right now. So because of the OTA with FARA, Dan Bailey and his team have FARA and have had the JMRTD program. So he is acting as a PM would for those, but there is no technically PM established for that because it's under an OTA. But he's doing all those functions and he's running with it. The PM, Steve Clark for FVL, really predominantly right now is focused on Flora with a product team for that. But they are tied at the hip because everything that we're doing for FARA is going to end up influencing the other one and vice versa. So they're very tightly tied, and between General Rugen and General Todd, I think they've both each side got one hand on the neck of both of them. When you talk about the CFT, there's nothing that happens in requirements development that isn't bounced between General Gaylor and General Rugen and the six-pack. I mean, they're thick as thieves. They're very tight. They stay aligned. And the goodness of the CFT and General Rugen is that we have microscopic attention at the senior leader level. The badness of the CFT is that we have microscopic attention at the senior leader level. So be careful what you ask for. We're getting a lot of attention, resources, guidance, decisions, but they are going through all of those levels and they're all paying very big attention to them because, as you all have heard many times, very substantial investment. General Rugen is probably leading the charge on what's capable. He is out, he's driving experiments and demonstration. You heard that from Ellis Golson. How do we demonstrate success? The Army's going to reinforce success, and you demonstrate success through demonstrations, experiments, learning, and making progress. And that is part of what you are seeing with the pace and the schedule to get after the objectives and the timelines that we've been given by the senior leaders of the Army to get after what the country needs us to do. So I'll leave it at that.
Anybody else want to? That wasn't a grenade. That was an easy one, right? So anyway, Alice, would you describe a bit what's going on in your sphere with Future Force organizational construct and what you're doing?
From an organizational perspective, obviously, over the last few years, the guidance has been to have one aviation brigade design that fit everybody. And that's mainly driven by the fact that in our doctrine, a division did not have assigned forces. A division was just a headquarters that, based upon the mission set, you put a division headquarters out there and then you aligned forces underneath it to accomplish the mission assigned. As we start to transition now to large-scale combat ops, that doesn't always work because you now have to fight a peer enemy with a different construct. So now you have divisions that are actually fighting as divisions. They have to shape, they have to designate a main effort, they have to realign forces, they have to sustain, they have to do a lot of the things that they haven't had to do for the last 15 years. So they also need support from a higher headquarters. There are going to be capabilities that we cannot afford to put in every division. So there will be a core echelon that now has capabilities that can be allocated. The challenge that brings to bear is that one size does not now fit all. So we're going to have to start looking at purpose-driven aviation brigade formations that may not all look the same. You may have more lift in one, you may have more attack in another. You may have theater aviation units that are predominantly all lift. So all that comes into play as we start to look at it, and we look at different theaters that have different requirements and different missions that have different requirements for a particular organization.
I'd like to open it up for any questions for the panel members, sir.
I work for the Futures Command at Redstone Arsenal. I'm an engineer. I have a question. How do you condemn the old obsolete product that's used on current legacy aircraft? Do we have to wait for future lift to come on? Can we do it incrementally? Yeah. Well, how do you condemn the old obsolete products that are used on 50-year-old, 60-year-old aircraft like Chinooks and Apaches and Blackhawks that are like obsolete products, but they're working. My grandfather was working with a, cart, so why are we using smartphones? Why aren't you using rotary dial? They worked. But what I mean is it's more efficient. Why can't we condemn it? We have to go through another 10 years of process or what? As an engineer, it's very frustrating. There's no incentive to be innovative. Do you have any ideas?
Yes, sir. We'll see. Yep, I'm hot. So, sir, I think there's kind of two answers to that question. One is those platforms you just talked about in some of those systems. I think the enterprise is very much acknowledged. Those platforms will be around for years to come, and even some of those systems. So if you thought about something like CMOS, detection capability that's resident on aircraft now, that will still be in the force for years to come. Ultimately, there will just be some newer capabilities delivered that will be the most advanced, but doesn't mean that older system will just be, immediately divested of, because any capability is better than no capability at all. Where out there right now, there are some aircraft, because we're only able to buy so many B kits of a particular capability, they have possibly zero detection or zero defeat capability, just because we couldn't afford that many B kits. So that's kind of that piece. Now, the more rapid piece is what I talked about when I talked about the more open systems approach and how we would continuously compete. Once we create that environment where there's common processors, where the government has shared and will share that interface with everyone because it's owned, the hardware and software associated with that technology, as it's developed, should be able to be brought onto the aircraft. And I think also one key thing, acknowledging that there will always be an OFP that will be associated with flight critical type events or flight critical hardware and software. But there are so many other things that don't have to go through that OFP, and that OFP right now definitely slows us down with regards to time, and there's some cost associated with that too. Really significant cost is what I would say. So these common processors, as much as possible, will be on the opposite side of the firewall. And so when industry comes, there's a competition and there's a new sensor, a new application, the Army decides which one it's going to buy through competition, it will immediately be hosted on the aircraft. And I think it also gets into trying to create even not just an open systems approach associated with just a server or a processor, but that server and processor is really part of almost a universal A-kit. An A-kit that I know that at X locations on the aircraft, and even if you just think about ASE or DV or some of those things, there's optimal locations on the aircraft to provide certain capabilities. But industry knows at that location there will be this plate with this many screws, these types, and if they want to bring a sensor to compete for the next tranche of capability, they kind of know what they've got to do even on that hardware side, not just the tech side of it, and how we've laid that in. So I don't know, hopefully that answers your question, but that's how we're thinking about it. And no, we want to be able to change technology as fast as it changes.
Okay, so I guess I would approach that a different way. And I would start with you fight with the enemy, with the systems you have, not the ones you want, and physics gets a vote. So there's just a reality in how quickly we can build. And I think I would disagree with you. I think there's plenty of incentive out there right now to innovate. The question is where to innovate. There's some disagreements on that. People value different camps, value different things. So what we're trying to do is balance that value and make sure that that value is worth pursuing. It's achievable and feasible. We don't want to invest in something only to find out that we went a little too fast and we didn't get what we wanted. And it's still going to take time. You got to bend the metal. You got to make sure it works. And until you do that, you got to have something to fight with. And then the question becomes, how much do you invest in the current fleet to keep it validated? That's a value judgment. And that value judgment is informed as we learn. What's feasible? How quickly can we get it? How reliable is it? I would love to be able to snap my fingers tomorrow and buy every FLRAA we need tomorrow. But I would tell you that everybody would be employed for a year and then we wouldn't buy aircraft for 10 years and nobody would be employed and the cost of those aircraft would be astronomical. So when you rub a little reality on that, the truth is we're going to live with the current fleet for a while. We're going to find a way to keep them as viable as we can. And I think there's plenty of incentive to go after what we're seeking to achieve. And based on everything I've seen, FAR and FLRAA are very achievable. We just got to lock down the requirements. We've got some more information, which is why we've got the RFIs and the RFPs and taking the tact we are, and we're looking for every opportunity to appropriately accelerate with the right amount of risk, with what funding, time, and the manufacturing base and industry can help us to make sure we get it right. That's what we owe, is we got to get it right.
It's going to make it come down. I should have gotten somebody.
As you challenge the future to try and do better, have you looked at your rigs that go with some of these systems so you can more quickly test without actually getting in the air and go forward? That seems to be a way to save time with a regular system Because if you can do it on a rig and you find it, then you can settle it. But if you don't have the rigs or a way to go to it, it makes it harder if you have to wait till you have that B kit to stick it on there. If you put the B kit on the rig, you could put a lot of challenges on it at much less expense than a flight hour.
So I would tell you, yes, we are. The testing community is being challenged, just like the rest of us, for requirements development. And industry's being challenged. There's some answers to be gotten there. Again, value and risk. Where can you assume those risks? Where can we do that and accelerate or change those testing processes with the confidence, the right level of confidence, that we're not going to create more problems in the long run? I think you see that with JMRTD is a great example of that. We've learned a lot of lessons from JMRTD. Looking at thresholds of risk, who accept those, what can be modeled. But I will also challenge you that there's a lot of unknown unknowns. So, we're not building single rate, well, we may be, but we're potentially not building single main rotor helicopters for these next few. We're getting into new configurations, we're getting into new materials, we're getting into new technology, we're getting into the integration and to get away from federated systems. All of those things are going to bring unknown unknowns that we haven't encountered yet. So no matter, I think it's been proven, through some other programs of recent, I won't name them, that no matter how well they planned and what their history was and what their experience was and what they thought they computer modeled, there are still things to be discovered. Those are what keep me up at night. I think we can lock down the requirements, but not knowing what the unknown unknowns are, and we're not going to know them until we stumble into them, that we thought we modeled out and didn't, but we just don't know yet. And so I think we're going to find those out. But the short answer to your question is, General Rugen is championing and challenging the community from requirements development through development, through testing, all the way through. He's challenging everybody to innovate and move left and not duplicate work. We've had incredible synchronization with the S&T community and the requirements community that he kind of champions to make sure that we're not duplicating effort. We're not doing something industry's doing, and how do we not duplicate what industry does and still have the ability to be objective and assess what they do for our level of confidence so that we can check off and say we're good with that. He's challenging all of those, so I think we are moving forward in that.
My experience from a while ago as the ASEPM, I would bring something up and look really good at the manufacturers and then go out to Point Mugu and discover some things that we knew somewhere in the system. And we observed the more that you could check it out when it's on the rig, to a certain extent, it's a lot cheaper and you can go forward. And synchronization with a threat, as you mentioned earlier, is really important because sometimes there's little things in there that just don't show up until you get out flying against a real one.
Yes, sir. From a conceptual standpoint, we're trying to use a lot of modeling and simulation, basically an electronic rig, if you will, to kind of replicate the force, put it in a combined arms environment, because aviation is not the only people on the battlefield. So that also gives us the opportunity in the survivability standpoint to look at, okay, what does the armor or infantry force or the artillery force bring to us to reduce the threat so we don't have to put so much on the airplane. But that modeling and simulation also helps us to look at what are the actual requirements. We can put it in there and say, okay, we're going to fly the airplane at 50 feet and at 75 knots. See how well it survives. Then we can go back and say, okay, we're going to fly it at 50 feet at 100 knots and see if there's a difference. So we can actually get at not only the requirement for the survivability system, but also the requirement for the actual platform itself in order to help it survive. So that there is a lot of modeling and simulation, high fidelity modeling that's going on that will help us drive the actual, not only attributes, but the overall capabilities of the force.
With what you're saying, the location that your item finally gets to grab is normally not ideal, and whether it's still going to do what you wish I'm sure you've got to look at as you go along. Because I've been to the range and you can't put it there because this is there, or you put it there and it doesn't work, and they get some tape and keep running around to try and find an acceptable area.
Yes, sir. As General Mangum once schooled me, all models suck and some are useful. So that's kind of we have to, once we get it into a model and say, okay, it comes out about this much, then as you say, we're going to have to put it in a live situation and verify that what we think is going to happen is actually going to happen.
And the other part is that you're talking about very wisely is examining your requirements, hopefully having an idea what you're going to need when you go ahead. I've seen us go into those things and not really have good requirements. And when you get through, you've got a whole lot of data and you're trying to figure out whether you approved what you weren't sure you needed. Yeah. I'm not trying to fuzz it up. I'm just sharing the past.
Yes, sir. That's one of the things that the Army Futures Command has brought on board is that the TRADOC Analysis Center is now the Requirements Analysis Center and belongs to AFC. So they are looking at everything and actually having the top-down process is really driven by the analysis. So here's what we think the gaps are. Here's the high priority gaps. Here's the ones we really need to fill, and then we go on down from there. So there's a lot of focused effort heading in the direction that you're talking about.
And the only other thing that's come to mind is with the composite airframes, you have challenges you didn't have with metal airframes, and I'm sure you're more aware than I.
This time, we'd like to remind you to stop by L3 Technologies booth number 656 to learn more about solutions supporting Army modernization. Mention the keyword VALID and get a free gift. Again, stop by L3 Technologies booth number 656 to learn more about solutions supporting Army modernization. Mention the keyword VALID and get a free gift.
Well, I made
in just a few minutes, East-West at booth 1050 is having a toast to Army Aviation. 2:30 this afternoon. Again, East-West at booth 1050 is having a toast to Army Aviation.
The composites bring challenges which you know better than I, but you really have to have them in mind because every now and then you've got something that's hard to sort.
But you know, sir, composites also bring a lot of things that we are going to be able to do, such as get rid of antennas that provide a lot of drag on that airframe. Because
one other question I have, to follow up my question that you answered. We still want to use the old legacy aircraft and the old components because we had to continue to buy it. I appreciate that. But also, if the return on investment is less than a year, so why is it you still want to hang on to that philosophy of the old technology? Why can't you introduce small incremental improvements in the legacy aircrafts now?
So I would tell you that where it's appropriate, we do. The challenge is that a lot of the legacy, I won't call it legacy, the current fleet has limitations in our value. So can you, should you? The difference between can and should is value. And what we're trying to articulate and determine is where is the right value and when does the value make sense for us to make that investment. There's a lot of things that we could continue to do to the current fleet, but the value of that investment, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. Some we don't have a choice. Some, regardless of what the cost is, we might find that we have to make some investments. I won't hazard a guess at what all those are in order to keep faith with the soldiers and the air crews and the people that we support and provide those for. But some of those just may not make sense. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. Wait for the next. And really, those are a case by case. What's the technology? What's it cost? And what's the effort required to bring it back? And then how long are you going to use it? And what's the benefit? So it really all comes back to a case by case value assessment for each of those.
Thank you very much. This is about a SBIR project I had for 10 years. I'm still trying to get it on. It went through phase 2, phase 3, everything, and still can't get it. I can't even see the PM because he keeps on changing. So this is my problem, dilemma. How do you get the innovative ideas to the leadership?
I can't speak to that one. And I don't think we have a PM up here, but we can probably talk after this and I can ask.
If I were still in uniform, I would answer the question, but I don't feel like it's my place to do that. But anyway, if there are no other questions, we are going to. Oh, absolutely.
John, quite real quick on the MOSA statute requirements documents to identify requirements that are going to evolve. Is there a specific way the Army's doing that in CDDs now so the guys in Huntsville, when they write requirements, can write them such that they are open and not in vendor lock?
So I would tell you that from an operational perspective, that's more, as we talked to Dan Bailey, there's operational implications and desires and benefits for MOSA, absolutely. But the requirements are those, what we're probably at the stage of in requirements documents is that you will apply MOSA. Dan Bailey and his team, as they go through the MSAD and work with MOSA, I think that gets more toward the specification side of the house, which I don't think is our bailiwick for operational requirements, and it gets more into the PM of how do you achieve and realize. Now, I would tell you that what is in our side, and I'll give you an example, is and that's why we call it an approach and not an architecture, is that some of it is not about face compliant and some of it is not about the architecture and the bus and the specifications. Some of it is just the approach to design. So I'll give you an example. If you have ASC, we have certain ASC systems, and I'm going to get in his lane, he's going to slap me later when we leave. We have ASC systems that we want to rapidly reprogram, and one might be designed just strictly by the design approach that the OEM took. It can rapidly be reprogrammed and updated. And we have another one that can't be because of the way it was built and the integration of its operational functions and its data library or how it interacts with the hardware. It wasn't built with an approach to be rapidly upgraded. And that's an aspect of MOSA from an operational perspective that we're seeking, but isn't really directly tied to being face compliant or somebody else being able to plug into it. So there is a technical specification application to this to allow us to change hardware, rapidly upgrade software, and then there's a design approach to allow us to integrate reduced federated application that goes after weight and a bunch of other things, and then just to be able to rapidly use it from an operational perspective. And I'm going to let Ryan add to that if he wants to.
Now, I think Mike hit it. As far as requirements go, operationalized requirements where we're describing why an open systems approach is so important. FACE, that's part of it, but I would tell you FACE isn't detailed enough. And I think we really are. There's a lot being put into what MSAD will deliver with regards to that next round. Like, what will the more specific standards be? At some point we are going to have to define what the interface is and then own that, and then, like I said earlier, distribute that to everyone. That interface, any company, any business that thinks they can put something on a helicopter, however they think they're going to put it on it, they do it through that interface, which they can all get. I do believe that interface, at least at this point, and I could be wrong, that interface will be maintained by some industry partner if that's who we purchase it from. I don't know that we'll want to get into the business of continuously updating it. Almost, this might be oversimplified, but almost like Windows. You go from Windows 7 to Windows 10 to Windows whatever's next, right? The government isn't responsible for those updates. We just make sure we put them on our computers. And that may be overly simplistic, but I think that's where we're moving with that open systems approach. And yes, there is a round of standards and specifics next from the government that'll continue to keep that momentum moving.
From a conceptual standpoint, though, the requirement for MOSA is an absolute. Because, yes, we have MDO right now, which has been published as the Army Operating Concept. This time next year, we'll have MDO 2.0. And then probably 5 years from now, we'll have something that replaces MDO. So my point being is that the requirements, the threat, the technology, and everything is changing so rapidly that if we don't have an open systems approach, we're not going to be able to keep up. And that somewhat flies into the face of what I think you are bringing up into the acquisition law that specifies how we acquire things. And so our need for rapid innovation and change, the acquisition law has to keep up with that too. And that's going to be a challenge.
Mike Burns needs a break, I'm pretty sure, because he's got to come back. But having, in a previous life, 2 years of scar tissue of working in the requirements determination and development business, I just want to thank you all for all your great work that you're doing. It's really hard business, and they're doing a great job in terms of doing that for the aviation branch and the force. So again, just want to thank you for all you've done. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.